Nestled on a secluded ridge in Blacksburg, Virginia, on the outskirts of Virginia Tech's campus, a house has stood for 250 years. It has been a quiet observer to all walks of life, births, deaths, and all that falls between. It witnessed the birth of this nation firsthand, and it watched as the nation turned against itself. It's seen it all, and still it stands.
Historic Smithfield is not your average local history museum. This museum is a lens by which the breadth and the length of American history can be viewed.
The land was the home of Native Americans who settled and thrived here for thousands of years before the arrival of English speakers.
Smithfield is in a unique situation. A lot of museums are there because of one day in 1865 or because one notable person lived there. With Smithfield, it's all of that and more.
Historic Smithfield is a ground zero of the history of Blacksburg.
It's the United States in miniature. It is said to be the first plantation established west of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
The museum sits at the crossroads of a lot of America's most consequential events. The first expansion is outside of the original 13 colonies. It teaches us about the legacy of slavery and emancipation. And it's also very important because of the executive leadership on the state level and the national level that came right out of this house.
It's not one of the gigantic first family of Virginia, the Lees, the Carters, the Byrds, but it's the Appalachian equivalent of the first families. The Prestons were among the first to settle here and were probably the leading political and social family in this area for several generations.
The story of this land may go back thousands of years, but for the Smithfield house, the story begins with one man.
Colonel William Preston, as he would later be known in life, was born on Christmas Day in 1729.
William Preston was an immigrant, arrived as a child from Ireland.
When William Preston came across the Atlantic at age 8, he had a decision to make. He could follow in his father's footsteps and learn the trade of a carpenter, or he could be taken under the wing of his maternal uncle, who was the chief executive officer of the New River Company.
He worked initially for his uncle, James Patton, and began becoming a surveyor. And on the Virginia frontier, the only source of wealth was land. The person who knew the land best and could identify the best land first was the surveyor. And so William Preston was at the head of the line to claim land in Southwest Virginia.
Of course, someone has to lose on this arrangement. That would be Native Americans who called this land home for so many years prior to the arrival of the English speakers.
William Preston developed into one of the wealthiest self-made men in Southwest Virginia. He settled in Fincastle, Virginia, and built his first plantation, Greenfield.
William Preston had a lot of irons in the fire in the years leading up to and the years of the American Revolution. He was what was referred to as a county lieutenant, so essentially the right-hand man to the king's governor in Williamsburg. He was a member of the House of Burgesses at a time. He had significant financial transactions, agricultural activities that went on not only here at Smithfield, but back at Greenfield and other properties that he owned. The raising of hemp and the sale of whiskey. And of course, he also was a local militia commander. William Preston, in this neck of Virginia, in the years prior to and including the American Revolution, would have been a very powerful man.
Preston was one of the signers of the Fincastle Resolutions, a predecessor to the Declaration of Independence, the first adopted statement by colonists promising resistance to the British Crown should certain grievances not be addressed.
It would have taken a very patient person to be able to compartmentalize and to deal with all of those stresses going on at the same time. William Preston had a very important skill, and that was the skill of de-escalation. And so when there were problems between English speakers, Native Americans, William Preston would step into these situations and a lot of times was able to take a very tense and hostile situation and de-escalate it. Of course, many legacies are mixed legacies. And while he's diffusing tensions among Native American leaders and calling upon his relationships that he has been forming his entire life with those folks. At the same time, he's facilitating the movement of English-speaking settlers down Great Wagon Road, through the Cumberland Gap, and into the new county of Kentucky. It's a very complicated situation, William Preston's relationship with Native Americans.
While living in Fincastle, it seems William Preston sought a new way to expand his growing assets when he bought into the ever-increasing industry of the slave trade.
We honestly don't know when William Preston may have first purchased an enslaved African. The first that we can document is in 1759, the True Blue, which was an English ship, normally carrying enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa to the West Indies. That year, in the summer of 1759, it came into Chesapeake Bay, carrying a load of about 200 people from what's now the nation of Ghana. Virginians frequently went to Maryland to buy slaves because Maryland didn't tax them as much, and so it was cheaper.
On August 28, 1759, William, who had traveled to Maryland, purchased 16 individuals who had just arrived off the True Blue at about 47 pounds a head.
We do not know who he bought, whether they were adults, children, male, female, but he then brought them back and began from then on building his labor force of enslaved Africans.
My name is Kira Mosley Hobbs. I am Executive Director of the More Than a Fraction Foundation. We are a family of people who were enslaved at Smithfield from 1759 up through emancipation. First fraction is, they call him Jack, his son John, and then his son Thomas, and then Thomas's son Frank, and then Frank's daughter Isabel, and then Isabel's daughter Susie, and then Susie's daughter Eunice, and then Eunice's daughter is Kira. So we believe that the first fraction was likely one of the first 16 off the True Blue ship. We don't have the name of the first 16, but when you see Jack kind of first appear on records is when Smithfield still has very few enslaved and he's there already, which implies that he was probably one of the first 16. We end up enslaved by the Prestons pretty consistently.
The matter of slavery is an issue that troubled some of William Preston's descendants through the years. Those that had served in the Revolution or had parents that were alive during the Revolution had a hard time compromising the ideal that all men are created equal with the ideal of slavery. Some had no compunctions at all. At least that's what their writings tend to indicate.
Largely utilizing his new enslaved workforce, William Preston constructed a new plantation about 50 miles from Greenfield in Montgomery County, Smithfield.
If one were to stand on the grounds of Smithfield and just look around the area, one would see that William Preston was very deliberate and purposeful in building his home here atop this ridge. It's easily defensible. There was a stockade that surrounded the house and some of its major outbuildings. It had ready access to a spring and to a creek for drinking water. And also, it's just a lovely spot. William and Susanna Smith Preston were the parents of 12 children biologically. They adopted a child. Susanna Smith Preston was a Smith of Hanover County. She was what you might call a Virginia blue blood. She was a powerfully well-educated woman. She was 19 when she married William Preston, who was 11 years her senior. Her tutor was the Reverend Patrick Henry, who is the Patriot Patrick Henry's uncle.
William Preston was educated, but not in the same classical vein as his wife. His family entrusted this endeavor to the Reverend Craig, a Presbyterian minister who provided him with history, mathematics, and penmanship.
William and Susanna Smith Preston fancied that all of their children should be afforded the advantages of education, regardless of whether they were male or female. That dedication, that emphasis on education in the lives of their children had lasting effects.
One notable descendant of the Prestons was their daughter, Letitia Preston Floyd. Being raised and taught in her early years by the enslaved, Letitia, like her siblings, was also under the tutelage of educators brought to Smithfield to teach the Preston children. Letitia grew into a free-thinking woman who, as the wife of a Virginia governor, became involved in politics and expressed an anti-slavery stance. She also became the earliest family historian and author. She valued education and books above all, expressing that the use of books in the Virginia frontier gave to each family possessing them a station which outranked many wealthier families.
William Preston had every reason to be very stressed out during the war, not only because he had to manage his role as the county surveyor for Montgomery, not only because he had a number of business interests that could reverse at any time, not only because there were a large number of enslaved workers and indentured servants on this plantation, but on top of it, he was concerned, as were many Western Virginia patriots, that the Redcoats could come through at any time and disrupt his operations. Though no attack was made on Smithfield during the American Revolution, that was always a threat and something that could happen at any point in time.
The enslaved at Smithfield and beyond were offered their freedom in exchange for fighting for the British through a proclamation issued by Lord Dunmore in 1775.
They thought about the British's position, and they thought about the British offer, that if you fight for us, we'll free you, and they didn't take them up on the offer. And so, because almost everything else that my ancestors did was wise, in terms of me being here today, I have to assume that they had some information that I don't quite understand today, and fighting for the British was not an option for them.
The stress of the war did not only fall on the shoulders of William Preston. All the inhabitants of Smithfield were under pressures that they had not yet experienced up to this point, and Susanna Preston was certainly not immune. One family tale that was passed down tells of Susanna and all of the enslaved workers on the plantation rushing to defend the Virginia treasury. The Virginia State Treasury had been sent to Smithfield for safekeeping, much to Susanna's dismay, since her husband was away on surveying trips most of the week. One Saturday evening, while most of the enslaved workers were at their merriment night at the Merry Tree, Susanna, feeling the pressure of having the treasury in her home, bolted the doors and checked to ensure the bell rope was within reach, as the large bell could be heard a mile away.
She was cut from a different cloth. Susanna Smith Preston was certainly no wilting flower.
Strong in character, intellect, and physical vigor, Susanna was brought to the brink of death by typhus just after giving birth to her 8th child. She managed to survive and go on to birth 4 more children.
Smithfield was affected during the Revolutionary War by something that was devastating to soldiers, and that is smallpox. We know from period accounts that some enslaved at Smithfield and some indentured servants were killed by smallpox.
Preston had stipulated in his will that Anne's siblings should provide for her when he was gone.
William and Susanna lost a child in 1782 named Anne. He was very highly favored, especially by Colonel Preston.
After Anne's unexpected death from smallpox, Preston sent his sons to be inoculated from the disease.
It was a very difficult loss for him as a father. He would pass away the following year. William Preston died in 1783 with Susanna at his side.
Although William Preston lived at Smithfield for just shy of a decade, Susanna would call it home for 50 years.
She never remarried, and she would go on to live 40 years after William Preston's death, passing away in 1823. And though by the norms of the day, she wouldn't be considered the rightful owner of Smithfield, she did run the operation nevertheless. Enslaved people performed tasks that the self-sufficiency of the plantation was dependent upon.
They built Smithfield. The money crop at that time was hemp. They did all the work to grow the hemp, and then the hemp had to be processed before it could be turned into a material for rope. They did all of that. Literally everything that you see around you was the result of the labor of enslaved Africans. Quite a number of the enslaved at Smithfield would on Sundays have gone to church in Blacksburg with the Prestons. Southern plantation owners often required enslaved people to go to church because they thought that hearing selected portions of the Bible about servants obey your masters, that this would help create good, quiet slaves. The Prestons kept very, very few records of plantation operations.
The records of the specific operations of the plantation are few and far between, but we do know some things about the life of the enslaved people who called Smithfield home. These families include the Fractions, the McNortons, the Saunders, the Poindexters, and the Moons.
They would work Monday through Friday, have usually often Saturday afternoons off and Sundays off. The Prestons did, well, I can't say they encouraged, but couples married at Smithfield. Now, they could not marry legally, but they were allowed to form family unions. Those families could be broken up at any time. The Prestons had the authority legally to sell any individual at any time. And so married couples weren't guaranteed to be kept together, nor were the children to be kept together. But the Prestons seem to have sold relatively few slaves. And based on the genealogy we've been able to do, a number of these families, the McNorton family, the Fraction family, were here for multiple generations. So you probably had intact families living in the quarters.
The enslaved population was actually divided up 4 different times, and that was during Susanna's lifetime. So perhaps sitting right here in this room, she initiated the documentation that would separate friends and family members, and they would go with different members of her family and may never see each other again.
The enslaved probably lived in relatively small log cabins, which we think were probably a couple of 100 yards out the front of the house towards where the Mary Oak stood. Many of the enslaved who were on the True Blue probably came from Ghana and other areas in West Africa. And in West Africa, it's quite common among some of the tribes in that area. They don't worship trees, but they often see large trees as a place where spirits live. Not a holy place, but an important place. They often will then use those trees as central points for a variety of ceremonies, so that if a child is born, they may celebrate at this particular tree. Marriages may occur around that tree. It's a place in which individuals can solicit the goodwill of the spirits. If someone dies, they may pause at this tree on the way to the burial.
We actually lost the knowledge that the Mary Tree existed until we found out Smithfield still existed, and we started to go visit. So the first person that visits is me. And when I arrived at the parking lot of Smithfield's, you could see the Mary Tree out in the field. It's just standing there alone. At the time, Virginia Tech was growing corn and stuff around it. And when I got out the car, I just stood in the parking lot staring at the tree. And that's when the executive director at the time, she met me in the parking lot and she was like, what made you stop at the tree? And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, do you know what that tree is? And she was telling me how the Prestons had documented that it's where we used to gather. And I didn't really take too much into it until I started taking other family members and descendants down, and we all had the same pause without anyone telling you what the tree was. It's descendants, no matter where in the country we find them, when we bring them to Smithfield, there was always that pause at the tree before you told them what it was.
James Patton Preston, the 8th child of William and Susanna Preston, and the first child born on the property, became the rightful heir and owner of Smithfield Plantation upon the death of his father, William, when James was just 8 years old. Susanna continued the daily operations up until her death, at which time James Patton Preston took over the duties completely.
During the ill-fated invasion of Canada during the War of 1812, James Patton Preston was critically wounded, but the wound did not end up taking his life. Later, he would be breveted as a general. It wasn't long after the conclusion of that conflict that he was elected governor of Virginia. Due to the wound that he received in Canada, James Patton Preston was crippled for the remainder of his life. He returned to Smithfield to recuperate, and he hadn't been here at Smithfield very long before he decided to seek the governor's seat, and he was elected to that role.
The death of an owner was always a time of tremendous anxiety for the enslaved, because most owners had multiple children. Most owners were also in debt, and slaves were the single most valuable asset that most Southern planters held. So when an owner died, such as James Patton Preston, or when his father, Colonel William Preston, died, anytime an owner died, the estate was going to be divided among children or among debtors, and be divided locally. So for example, when James Patton Preston died, his 3 sons divided the plantation and had 3 contiguous plantations. And so families may have been divided among Robert Taylor Preston at Solitude and James Francis Preston at Whitethorn. But Whitethorn and Solitude are only about 2 miles apart. And so it was still entirely possible for those families to maintain some contact, even perhaps to continue living together and basically commuting to work at the other plantation.
After the death of James Patton Preston, his son, William Ballard Preston, took over the operations at Smithfield with his brother, Robert Taylor Preston, at Solitude, and James Francis Preston at Whitethorn.
William Ballard is my favorite Preston. Not because I necessarily like him or agree with him. I think he's the messiest in terms of his stance in history.
William Ballard Preston, or Ballard as the family referred to him, was the owner of Smithfield at the outbreak of the American Civil War. Prior to the outbreak of the war, Ballard had discouraged Virginia leaders from seceding from the Union to join the Provisional Confederate States.
He had enslaved people. In his early 20s, he's in the Virginia Senate and he's pushing for the emancipation of enslaved people in Virginia.
He was well known to Abraham Lincoln. The two had served in the House of Representatives together, and they both believed that slavery must inevitably end at some point in the future.
William Ballard Preston, when he was a young man, was a member of the General Assembly during a famous debate in 1832. So the General Assembly had the last extended debate in Virginia about whether or not to, in any way, start the process of abolishing slavery.
Even in his speech and his actions, he talks about us, about God-given rights, about us being people and having a right to freedom, and how slavery is just against God and it's unnatural. Like, the language is like that.
William Ballard Preston spoke very eloquently about the fact that slaves were human beings and that slaves wanted to be free. But like most white Virginians, William Ballard Preston could not conceive of what do we do with former slaves. We can't have free black people living in Virginia. Blacks and whites simply cannot live together.
Though he opposed secession, Ballard was directed by the Virginia Secession Convention to write the Ordinance of Secession. It was voted upon and it was largely accepted. And with that, Virginia left the Union and cast its lot with the Confederacy.
What he did say is, if there comes a time when it is in Virginia's best interest to free slaves, then the Assembly has the right to do that. But he never said, this is the time to do it. And during the course of his lifetime, he never freed a slave. Ballard Preston, like Thomas Jefferson, like most white Southern planters, may have felt that slavery was wrong, but the alternative was worse to them.
Ballard Preston had a complicated relationship with slavery. It continued to serve him well and to ensure that he would enjoy a standard of living like his ancestors had. However, he did have personal compunctions that his writings revealed to us about slavery, about its future.
The impact of the Civil War on Smithfield was mixed. On the one hand, they actually made a lot of money during the war. The Prestons owned not just Smithfield. William Ballard Preston owned thousands of acres of land in Henry County, tobacco land, and actually had more slaves in Henry County than he had here at Smithfield.
He gets an additional plantation through his marriage. He just almost never deals with it, as if he don't want to touch it. He has someone else manage it and oversee it. I think there's an additional maybe 100 enslaved people over there. And it's almost like he doesn't want to deal with or benefit from slavery, but he also doesn't want to take the risk of what not doing it would do to his life and his career. He's clearly making choices to maintain it, but I feel like it bothers him at the same time. So if there was any Preston that I could talk to and question, it would be him.
Fortunately for the residents of Smithfield, the war did not come through and play the devastating role that it did in places such as Northern Virginia.
For the enslaved, about a half dozen of them were conscripted into Confederate service. The Confederate government regularly during the course of the Civil War required slave owners to send a certain number of slaves for usually 3 months at a time to work on building fortifications, repairing railroads, dredging canals.
The reason why I don't think that they necessarily thought something was going to come out of it, because remember, they're at Smithfield. So they have William Ballard Preston, who wrote up the Articles of Succession for Virginia. So he probably had a conversation with them that the other enslaved communities didn't get. They are enslaved by an individual who is deep into the political side of the Civil War. So it's not hearsay, it's not coming through the grapevine. They probably see the complexity of William Ballard like we do today, of him being up and down, up and down.
For he died only 1 year into the Civil War and was a sitting member of the Confederate Congress at the time of his death.
Ballard died of heart disease in 1862, a very conflicted man. Virginia Fraction Capers was born into slavery on the Smithfield Plantation. The daughter of John and Esther, she began helping to raise Preston children from the time she was 12 to 13 years of age. She was loved and revered as the Fraction family historian. Thomas and Othello Fraction were two of Virginia's younger brothers, also born at Smithfield, who were not content to sit by and wait for change, but instead forged ahead with determination of a better future for their descendants.
Thomas, I call him grandfather because I want him to be that. I am so proud of him. You see, I smile when I think about him, because at the same time, he took so many risks. It's the fact that I exist today is a miracle, because for the times he probably should have been lynched, killed, shot, or something. But his tenacity from the very end to push back. And when he said in that letter, "I will not quietly submit," he meant it.
The Fraction family had been enslaved by the Prestons at least since the latter decades of the 18th century. John Fraction may have been among the first that were purchased from the True Blue.
After the death of William Ballard Preston, his wife maintained Main Smithfield, but the Fraction brothers were moved to Robert Taylor Preston's Solitude.
Robert Taylor Preston is my least favorite Preston. I think he was a little insane. He would just randomly just like cuss, almost like Tourette's, that he would do crazy stuff. Like he would send his enslaved man go all the way back to Smithfield to get his favorite cookies. Like he was just, I think something was wrong with him, and his obsession with us was odd.
The Union Army came into Montgomery County in 1865, just before the war ended.
So Robert Taylor Preston gathers up all the enslaved, and he's like, oh, if y'all escape or run, if I catch you, I'm gonna kill you. And clearly, Thomas, Othello, and Oscar was like, all right, bet, so we're gonna run.
Thomas and Othello fraction followed them south into North Carolina. And from North Carolina, the Union officer in charge of the expedition simply gathered up all of the enslaved who had followed him out of North Carolina into Virginia, then back into North Carolina, and sent them to Greenville, Tennessee, which was a training camp and base for the Union Army. They spent the next year and a half as members of the Union Army.
Robert Taylor Preston was vindictive about the fact that the Fraction brothers had self-liberated from his plantation and went to join a Yankee army.
Soon after Thomas and Othello joined the army, the Emancipation Proclamation was enabled to be enforced by the federal military.
In spite of what many Americans believe, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. The enslaved at Smithfield were still here, still working, until the spring of 1865, when the Union Army finally ended slavery in Virginia.
Booker T. Washington reported that for about 15 minutes, there was jubilation, there was wild excitement, there was so much happiness over this news of emancipation. But pretty quickly, that enthusiasm died down, because then the question comes to mind, what now? What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be emancipated?
If you were an enslaved person and they're saying, oh, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and you're in the middle of a war where half the country has decided that they are fighting against the government to become their own country, what does that government's declaration of your freedom mean when they're already saying we're not following this government, right? It doesn't mean anything yet.
Despite Lincoln's proclamation, the fighting continued with guerrilla attacks, and Thomas and Othello continued to fight along with the Union Army.
They spent most of their time guarding rail lines and bridges in East Tennessee, North Alabama. While in the military, in the spring of 1866, they requested leave to come home.
Before they actually come back to Blacksburg, they write a letter to their family and says, we've been a 30-day furlough, we're gonna come and visit. Some way, Robert Taylor Preston is aware of the letter, and so he writes his own letter back to Thomas and said that, you know, if you come back, I'm gonna kill you. Thomas writes a letter back, and it's like, I'm a trained soldier now, I got pistols. Thomas specifically says, I will not quietly submit. And I don't find him ever calling Robert Taylor Preston his master. He calls him the rebel. And so it's almost like this back and forth between them two, of one trying to get one to submit and one refusing.
They came back, they were members of the Union Army, in uniform when they came back, probably with their weapons when they came back. They came to visit their father, who was living and working still at Solitude in 1866.
They were determined not to wait on emancipation, but to play a key role in securing emancipation, not only for themselves, but for their brothers and sisters who were being held in bondage.
They apparently wanted to avoid any kind of conflict in their father's house.
Thomas and Othello tried to leave, but Robert and his posse, make it a Western, show up before they're able to get away, and they pull guns out on each other. Robert Taylor Preston shoots Thomas in the leg, and then he tells the people to put him in jail.
While in the army, Thomas in particular found great success, achieving the rank of sergeant. But that honor did not last long. His decision to visit his family during his furlough would prove to be detrimental.
During the Civil War, the highest rank a black man could hold is the rank of sergeant. When Sergeant Fraction was stripped of his rank and bussed down to the role of a private, that must have been quite a difficult thing for him to deal with. He had proven his worth as a soldier, and in just a short time had risen from private to sergeant. For almost a year and a half, the Fraction brothers were in and out of jail, in and out of courtrooms, trying to get cleared on these charges.
Every corner of his life, every moment, every minute, he fought back.
Like most plantations, Smithfield, both the white owner and the black workers, found themselves in a situation where the owner had lots of land but no laborers, and the former enslaved could work, but they owned no land. For a very short time, some of the enslaved from Solitude, Smithfield, and Whitethorn remained as farmhands on the Preston land. But most of them very quickly began migrating elsewhere in Montgomery County.
It wasn't long after Lee's surrender that soldiers were going through Virginia's forests and wildernesses and forcing former slaves to return to their masters. And they were forced, in many cases, to sign labor contracts with their former masters. If they want any kind of life, they're going to have to return to the same life they had as enslaved people. They have to settle for food, shelter, and clothing, which is the same stuff they got as slaves. So they could look at that situation and very understandably come to the conclusion that nothing's really changed. Instead of being enslaved to a person, now they're enslaved to their circumstances. It must have been tremendously disappointing.
Virginia, or Aunt Jenny as she came to be known, the older sister of Thomas and Othello, made the decision to stay with the Prestons after emancipation and continue on with the job and people she knew.
It seems that both James Francis Preston and Virginia's husband died at about the same time, probably sometime 1862, 63, 64, during the Civil War. That left both women as relatively young widows with young children, living and working in the house together. And they seem to have developed a genuine friendship for one another, I have to assume, because when slavery ended, there was great tension between the other members of the Fraction family and other members of the Preston family, to the point that within a few years, most of the Fractions had left Montgomery County and had moved down into Roanoke County to Salem. Virginia stayed at Whitethorn. She stayed at Whitethorn until she died. She could have gone elsewhere and gotten work, as most of the enslaved did from Smithfield and Whitethorn and Solitude. But the fact that she chose to remain there for 30 years after she was emancipated suggests that there actually was a relationship I suspect between her and Sarah.
Virginia left a will upon her death, and in it she requested that Sarah Caperton Preston be the guardian of her two granddaughters, Madeline and Rachel, until they were 21. Virginia Fraction Capert is buried in the Preston family cemetery.
6 generations hence would hold on to the house, and a 7th generation would be the owner of the house. That 7th generation descendant was Janie Preston Boulware Lamb.
In 1959, Lamb donated the house to the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, now known as Preservation Virginia.
From 1960 to 1964, there was a massive restoration effort that was done here at Smithfield. The house was returned to its colonial appearance, and a lot of structural issues were addressed. And it's because of those efforts from 1960 to 1964 that Smithfield has survived as long as it has.
In October of 1964, the house was opened to the public for the first time. Historic Smithfield leaves behind a legacy of education, from the first teacher that William Preston hired to tutor his children, to the campus it sits nestled inside today. In 1851, the Preston family was instrumental in the establishment of a Methodist boys' day school called the Olin and Preston Institute. After the war, it was renamed the Preston and Olin Institute to honor William Ballard Preston and operated thus until 1872.
The Preston Olin Institute was rebranded as the Virginia Agricultural Mechanical College. Shortly after that, more land is added, more buildings go up, and it's rebranded again as the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University.
The Preston family would continue that emphasis on education as different family members would play a critical role in the founding or development of over 20 colleges and universities across the United States. After the war ended, Thomas and Othello both moved their families north of Smithfield to Salem.
Othello's granddaughter passed away 5 or 6 years ago. Her name was Eva. I told her the whole story and she didn't know about Smithfield, about running, about joining the Union Army. She just said that her mother said that her father said that they deserved the best of everything. And so that's how she was raised. We successfully got Thomas his sergeant status back with the U.S. military a couple of years ago. We petitioned them, we gave them all the documentation to show the actions against him were racist for the time. U.S. Army took it very seriously and they took their time with it because when they called me about it, they said, whatever we do for Thomas takes precedence for the future, for any other U.S. colored troop at the time. And when they called me and told me that they were reversing his dishonorable discharge and changing it to honorable discharge, and that they were giving him his sergeant status back, we celebrated, and Virginia Tech's military department did a whole ceremonial thing at Smithfield, giving that back to him because we knew that it was important to him up until he passed away. I'm proud of him and I appreciate his consistency until the very end because most people would have gave up. When we first found Smithfield again and the family started going down, tree was fine. Tree was white oak tree and it was blooming, it was full. And after we started coming back, the tree rapidly started dying. And the arborist at Virginia Tech was confused. This is a scientific professional whose job it is to know and to manage trees, cannot figure out what was happening to the Mary tree. Brought in consultation with people who specialize in tree disease, trying to figure out what's going on in the Mary tree, and you just see it year after year, blooming less, branches falling off. And it's almost like the tree took a deep breath and was like, I was holding on till you got back, and now that you're back, I gotta go. And it went. And in 2021, a windstorm came and finished it off. Jack? Esther? Thomas? Othello, Oscar, Virginia, Granville, Wilson, Fanny, Flora, Cynthia, George. The ancestors approved. That's it.
The museum has a Glean Team garden for the food insecure in our area. So what the museum's actually doing with it is turning the old plantation system on its head. That is to say, instead of people working these grounds on an involuntary basis and for the profit of someone else, the people that are working the grounds at Smithfield today are very much doing that on a voluntary basis. And who are they benefiting? They're benefiting their entire community.
It, like almost any large farm or plantation in Virginia, is a testament to forced contribution that African Americans made to the wealth of this nation. It's also a testament to the effort of white Americans to build this nation. It was certainly not a peaceful coexistence. Many people associate the South with segregation and Jim Crow, which is by and large a 20th century phenomenon. If you had come to Smithfield anytime between 1774 and 1865, most of the people you met would have been African American. This country was built on slavery. Most Americans didn't own slaves. Many Americans objected to slavery. Plantations like Smithfield built the wealth that has continued to grow in this country.
I want the descendants after me to be able to visit. I think it is a micro example of what the United States process would be like to address this unfinished business of slavery. It's not going to be fast. It's not going to be one-off. It's going to take some time. A lot of people talk about it theoretically, but we have a chance to actually be two families of that history, and there isn't a book out there that explains it to us. The small steps of addressing the unfinished business of slavery, measuring how that affects everyone on all sides. Remember, the indigenous community is part of that. I think that's something we've been doing at Smithfield and Solitude under Virginia Tech, is remembering that there's an indigenous part of that story.
To the credit of the institution, as a whole, Smithfield has begun making real progress in trying to interpret the history of all of the people who lived and worked at Smithfield, not just the Preston family.
Not only does the colonial era of Smithfield matter because of all of the lasting legacies that came out of it, but the thousands of years before and the 250 years hence are all a great way to look at a microcosm of American history. This museum provides a perspective that few museums in America can provide. That's why it's important to protect this house and to maintain it so that its lasting historical legacies may be recognized and understood by future generations of Americans.
Historic Smithfield represents the legacy of the indigenous people who cared for the land and called it home for thousands of years before any English speakers stepped foot on its beautiful ridge. It represents the legacy of the Fraction family and all of the other enslaved families who built this country through the work of their hands and their achievements in the face of oppression. And it represents the legacy of the Preston family, who stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States founding fathers as they led the way to today's America.